Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Brown with the Center for the Rocky Mountain West, and I want to welcome you to the second in the President's Lecture Series for this academic year. I'd like to especially thank President Dennison and also Dr. Richard Drake, the coordinator of the President's Lecture Series. We're honored to have with us tonight for this evening's lecture Ambassador Andre Baeyens, who is the great-grandson of Montana Copper King and United States Senator William Andrews Clark. Senator Clark was one of the most successful industrialists of the Gilded Age in American history. His art collection, perhaps the finest one ever assembled of art done before 1900, was donated by him to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where it's considered the cornerstone of that famous museum's collection. Ambassador Baeyens is a retired member of the French Foreign Service. He was born in Paris of a French father and an American-born mother, Mary Cecilia Clark. He spent his formative years in the United States, in Washington, San Francisco, and New York. After studies in Paris in political science and law at the National School of Administration, he entered the Foreign Ministry in 1957. His first postings as a Secretary of Embassy were in London, Bonn, Washington, Rome, and Vienna. In 1974, he headed the personal staff of the Secretary of State to the French Foreign Minister in the first Chirac government in France back in 1974 to 1976. From 1977 to 1982, he was Director of the Press and Information Service of the French Embassy to the United States with offices in New York. From 1982 to 1985, he was ambassador to the Korean Republic, South Korea, and Seoul. And in 1986, was appointed ambassador and permanent representative of France to the United Nations institutions in Vienna. In 1991, he was deputy to the Director General of Cultural, Scientific, and Technical Relations at the Foreign Office in Paris. His last posting before retiring was Consul General of France in New York from 1993 to 1995. He now lives near Salzburg in Austria with his Viennese wife and his American-born Jack Russell Terrier. Having given lectures at New York University, at the European Union Studies Center at the City College of New York, at the Austrian Diplomatic Academy, and at the European Union College in Warsaw, Ambassador Baeyens is an officer in the Legion of Honor of France. And the title of his lecture this evening is From Copper to Corots, The Two Lives of William Andrews Clark. Please help me welcome Ambassador Andre Baeyens.
Thank you, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. It's not the first time that I've come to Montana, but it's the first time that I've come to Missoula, and I must say that I've been very well taken care of under this wonderful blue sky, and for me it's a joy to be here and to talk about my great-grandfather. Now, William Andrews was the name that he used all the time. William Andrews, not William, but William Andrews. That was the name of his maternal grandfather. He was born in 1839 in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, in the log cabin, which was, I think, a very good thing for some politician. He was a Presbyterian. The family came from County Tyrone in Ireland, and he died in 1925 in a mansion in Manhattan. Now, his life spanned the whole of the United States history, from 25 to 48 states, from America as an agricultural country to a world power when the American Army arrived in France in 1917. He built a mining empire. He was elected to the Senate of the United States. He was an art collector, but still he is largely unknown today, and I try to find out why. In fact, William Andrews Clark, I call him, lived two lives. In the 19th century, his life was in the West. It was concentrated around Butte and Montana, around mines, his politics, his first trip to France, his first family. The second life was in the 20th century. His main mine was in Arizona. He was a member of the Senate. He lived in New York. He had a second wife and a second family, and he took trips to France until World War I. The first part of this little presentation has to do with the 19th century, where William Andrews Clark pursued his ambitions in his youth. He had a ferocious will to, and I quote, better my condition in life. He had an eye for opportunities, he had quick reactions, and his endeavors were always carefully considered. He started his life as a man with a move to the West, out of reach of the Union laws and regulations. He left Ohio. His family had been in Pennsylvania before, and then in 56 or 57, they went to Ohio. And he left Ohio in 1862, just as the first battles of the Civil War were taking place. He left before the draft was pronounced in 1863. He was not a man to let a war interfere with his plans. Clark was typical of very many people taking advantage of that situation. It's interesting to see that among the contemporaries of Clark were Andrew Carnegie, born in 1835, Jay Gould in 1836, J.P. Morgan in 1837, John D. Rockefeller in 1839. You can see this was a generation which had the same idea at the same time to go off and make a lot of money in a place where they wouldn't be too worried by the federal government. So off he went from Ohio. He went to St. Louis, as everybody did at that time that were going west, and then further to Central City, Colorado. When he arrived, he was 23 years old. We don't know if he went by horseback or by mule or whatnot. Anyway, he went, obviously, with horses. He went to a mine. He worked in a mine that produced gold out of the quartz. But quite quickly, in a month of 2 or 3 months later, the word got around that gold had been discovered in Montana. So with a couple of pals, he took off in an ox train to go to Bannack, Montana, where he arrived in July of '63. There, upon arrival, he was told that there was something very interesting in Jeff Davis Gulch, and immediately jumped on his horse and went off and took 200 yards for his work, which obviously was to pan for gold, that type of activity being considered and called the poor man's mine. And he panned gold for 2 years. He spent the winters in Bannack. At one point, he took a trip to Salt Lake City and to listen to a sermon by Brigham Young. The first description of Clark was of that time. He was a small man, 5 foot 5 inches high. He had red hair, and he was wearing a shirt, and an army coat singed by campfire. That's the first vision we have of the senator. He settled in Montana. In '64, he sold his gold dust for several $1,000s, and he went into business. What he did was quite, I think, a very good thing to do. He had enough of this back-breaking work in water up to his knees, and he bought a series of little shops selling equipment to miners, selling to the miners what they needed for this work. And he had it was a chain of shops, in fact, in several cities of the West. In 1964, the same country, in the winter, there was this famous action which is something which is very much what the senator did well. he heard, I don't know how, he heard that a tobacco-laden ship had foundered in the Missouri River. And so he immediately galloped off to Boise, Idaho, and he bought several thousand pounds of tobacco and sold them when he arrived back in Helena. The city, my family law, what they say is that he arrived in a blizzard with his series of mules. He arrived in Helena at the Last Chance Gulf in a blizzard, and he sold all his tobacco for $6 a pound, having bought it from $1.50 a pound. So that was the type of thing that he did very quickly, and it brought money quickly also. In '65, he took his first step in politics. He attended the first meeting of the new legislature of the Montana Territory. The years that came afterwards were very pleasant. He settled in Deer Lodge, about 60 miles southwest of Helena, but you know that. He opened a bank with a capital of $50,000. The bank was called Donald, Clark, and Larrabee. In 1869, he went back to Connellsville to marry his childhood sweetheart, Catherine Stauffer. She was a Pennsylvania Dutch. And he brought her back to Deer Lodge. And between 1870 and 1877, they had 4 surviving children. 2 sons, Charles, known as Charlie, my grandfather, and William Andrews Clark, Jr., and 2 daughters, Mary and Catherine. And they also, with this new life, came a new sort of image of Clark. He became very fastidious. He had a wonderfully cut beard, well-shaped. He had elegant cutaways. He was very tough in business, but he was known to be true to his word. Then comes now the call of copper. The call of copper started in 1872. Clark was looking for new enterprises. He went to Butte, and the family stayed behind in Deer Lodge, to look into the possibilities of silver. At that time, there was great conversations whether or not the United States should switch from the gold standard to the silver standard. So we wanted to see if silver really was possible to mine. He arrived in Butte, already known and referred to, I should say, as the most important banker, trader, and capitalist in Montana. In Butte, gold had just been completely mined out. And silver was difficult. Silver had to be found by extraction from quartz. It was a difficult and expensive way of doing things. So he had to learn new technology. He spent a year in Columbia University Mining School in New York, 72 to 73, while Catherine and the children stayed in Pennsylvania with their grandparents. Copper, of course, was becoming the metal of the time. Electricity industry had started. It could be found under silver lodes. And Clark opened mines and built smelting works on the Butte Hill. By '86, he was producing 300 tons of ore a day. The family joined Clark in Butte. Both Clark and his son Charlie built houses in Butte. I saw them again yesterday, and you can see them. Also, William Andrews Clark Jr., the second son, had a house in Butte. And then Clark took over completely the management of the bank with his brother, and the bank was now known as W.A. Clark and Bro. His brother Joseph Ross towered over him. He was 6 feet tall. Now we come to a point which is very important. Clark discovers France. Clark was wealthy. He looked for a more refined and a healthier style of life than in Butte. In 1878, well, you know, remember that, what it was like. You couldn't see in the day because of the smoke and fumes that came out of the mines at that time. In the middle of the day, people walked about as if they were in the fog. In 1878, Clark took Catherine to Europe, perhaps with his children, or perhaps later, we don't know. But at any rate, in the next years, the family spent 2 years in Paris and 3 years in Dresden. From this cultural impact, from the use of foreign languages, from the visits of famous sites, came knowledge of foreign ways and views. And this was very important to Clark, and he would come every year for the winter to spend the winter with his family in Europe. Well, what convinced Clark to suddenly come to France? I have my own explanation. 2 years before he went to France, in 1876, there was a World Fair for the centenary of the United States in Philadelphia. That is 2 years before he left. And he attended the World Fair as an official orator of the territory. He made a speech about Montana, which was very well received. And the other thing which is interesting is that in that World Fair, the people who were building the Statue of Liberty, Laboulaye and Bartoli, who was the sculptor, were doing public relations for the Statue of Liberty. And to do that, they had set up in the fair the wrist and the hand of the Statue of Liberty holding the torch, and cut off here. And you could visit it by going in. There was a little door, and you went up the stairs, you came out on the little balcony, and this was a very good way of making the masses of the world understand that this is true, that we were going to build the Statue of Liberty, and people had to just understand and help what it was. Now, why not? I have the idea that Clark, as the representative of the state of Montana, had to go and see absolutely everything that was in the fair. And he saw this. He put his hand on the copper skin of the statue. He went upstairs, perhaps, around the torch, and perhaps there was a click at that point. He said, "This is French, this is copper, this is French, I must go to France." And why not? But this is my own. But anyway, when he came to Paris at that time, in 1878 and later, he observed a country that was still reeling from the sad and difficult events of the war with Prussia. In 1871, Prussia had completely defeated the French army, the army of Napoleon III. France had lost Alsace and Lorraine. A Prussian army was occupying the north of France, and France was obliged to give 5 billion gold francs to the German government. So this made the French rather resentment against the way the United States had remained neutral. There was no help for France, no help at all, no acknowledgement of the French help in 1783. And only the private Americans sent help to the people of Paris under siege. This is because, of course, Napoleon III was not playing very fair with the United States. As you know, although he said during the war, between the wars, that he would be neutral, he allowed the building of warships in French ports. He really was more for the South than for the North. He thought the South was made of distinguished people, many of whom could speak French, whereas the North was raucous people who couldn't speak any language at all. And so at that point, when the war started, the Secretary of State said to the French minister, "We are going to remain neutral. Forget it. We're not going to do anything for you." And this was something which the Americans were up against, in the sense that there was resentment on the part of the Americans, the French, and will be one of the reasons that the French created the Statue of Liberty. It was to give it to France, to remember, to make it sure that the Americans knew that the French and the Americans were the two largest and most important republics in the world, and that the next time that something like happened, the Americans would feel bound to come to the help of France. Those times were the difficult beginnings of the Third Republic. There was the horror of the Commune, you remember, when the masses found cannon and munitions and fought against the army. There were tensions between the Republicans and the Royalists. The constitution of the Third Republic only took 4 years to do it, and it came out in 1875. But Clark was not really interested in French politics. For him, France was on another level. He had in his mind an image of the peaceful Normandy or the beautiful Côte d'Azur. He saw the treasures and paintings that he was going to buy. And because he did so, he was so very soon known in Montana as the Paris millionaire. Clark had already bought his first painting in '84. This was a Biederstadt called Deer at Oneida Lake. It's now in the Yale Library, I don't know why. He bought started buying French masters, very classic, very old masters, 18th century. Chardin, a woman with saucepan, un Boucher, la musique, Madame Vigée-Lebrun, with her portrait of Elizabeth, the sister of Louis XVI. But he also bought Titian, Rubens, Gainsborough. All these were accepted works with solid prices, no risks at all. And not only paintings, he bought lace, he bought rugs and tapestry, he bought porcelain, he bought Majolica. He also, at that time in France, was in contact with architects for his future needs in New York. In 1894, plans were made for his mansion in Manhattan, the mansion that he was going to build in Manhattan. And the first plans were laid down by Henri de Glane, who had designed Le Grand Palais in Paris. And he was also making plans for a mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, north of Manhattan. And he was in contact with an American sculptor who lived in Paris called Paul Wayland Bartlett. That brings me to Clark in the 20th century, in his second life. In 1901, he took a seat in the Senate of the United States. He pulled out of Montana to concentrate on Arizona. He married again, a second family, and his love for France was stronger than ever, and he settled in New York. His great acquisition at that time was in Jerome, Arizona. He bought the United Verde in Jerome, and he bought it in 1888 after having looked at it for 3 weeks, going about with a pal of his in overalls and testing the ore by hand. And it turned out to be a place that had very high content of copper. So he bought this mine, which it was a complex. It had not only the mine, there was smelting, there was a foundry, and he bought it for $200,000 or $300,000. And at last, he was his own man. In Butte, he always had somebody from his family or other people. He had partners, and he'd always wanted to be sole man to decide which way this mine was going to go. And so he was almost the only shareholder. Two exceptions, the former president of the United Verde, who knew very well what was cooking, and an old lady in Maine who had 5 shares. All her family said, forget it, stop, sell them. She said, no, I'm going to keep them. And she made a rather small fortune with her 5 shares. In this enormous thing, he invested $6 million. Not only did he completely redo all the equipment, he put in railroads, he built a town for the people who worked there, which was called Clarkdale, and he was helped by his 2 sons, Charlie and William Andrews Clark Jr. In the 1910s, Clark was earning for himself and for his family $400,000 per month of the time. That's about $4 million now. And then when the First World War started and the need for ammunition started, he quadrupled what he was getting every month, which means that very quickly he was one of the 8 richest men in the United States. His bank was the equal of J.P. Morgan. His assets were superior to those of John D. Rockefeller. If you counted the unmined ore which was in the ground, if you put that in among the rest, it is exactly what it was. It was something superior to that of John D. Rockefeller. And gradually he was pulling out of Butte. There was the pressure, of course, of Standard Oil and the amalgamated copper, the war that was continuing against Marcus Daly for the Anaconda workings. And then also, that was a time when he took his seat in the Senate. I'm not going to go into much into his political life because I'm sure you know about it in any way. Professor Fritz, I'm sure, is explaining this to you much better than I can. We're not going into detail, but there are 2 things that you have to keep in mind. First of all, that in those days, senators were elected by the legislature and not by the people. And so it meant that to be elected, he had to shall I say, convince 25, 30, 35 people. 2 quotes will give you an idea of how it all went. Charlie Clark, his eldest son, is quoted as saying the 3rd time he was trying to win, had a campaign. This is the 3rd campaign that he made to become senator. We'll put the old man in the Senate or in the poorhouse. And the other one is from the senator who said, I never bought a man who wasn't for sale. It gives you an idea of... At any rate, he was finally elected in 1901 without any problem. There was no hanky-panky going on. He was helped by the fact that his arch enemy, Marcus Daly, was dying. So he moved into the Senate in 1901. He did his 6-year mandate and participated nicely in the different commissions. He was obviously in the Commission for Mines. He was also, curiously, in the Commission for Foreign Affairs. And this is because a friend of his, a Texan, had been appointed to go into this, and he said, I don't know about the foreign words, but you have to get Clark. Clark can speak those languages, and he's been to those countries. So they changed, and Clark was, which is absolutely extraordinary for a junior senator who had never been senator before, to go into this very prestigious committee. He did his 6-year mandate. It was not renewed. He didn't try to run again. He had done what he wanted. He wanted to be in the club. He wanted to be called senator for all the rest of his life, and he did. Then, sadness, Catherine, his wife, died in 1893. She was in New York, and Clark was in Butte. A few months later, after the death of Catherine, a very young woman in her late, she was not yet 20 years old, called on Clark in his office, and with a very self-assured sign, said she would hope that Clark would finance her studies. She had black hair, dark eyes, and her name was Anna Eugenia Lachapelle, of French-Canadian origin. And Clark immediately entered her into the Deer Lodge seminar, which meant in school for ladies, young ladies, and then he sent her to Paris to finish, as we say. accompanied by a lady, and I think that it was his sister who went to Paris with Anna. Now, the Paris of Anna, where she arrived, was not the Paris of the 1978. The Paris of 1900 was completely different. The Eiffel Tower had been built. It was the center of scientific development in Europe. Pasteur, Pierre and Marie Curie were at their height. The industry of France was rapidly growing. In 1900, France produced 3,000 automobiles. In 1914, 180,000. It was the city of light. It was the greatest cultural center in Europe and therefore in the world. There were very interesting toing and froing between the United States and France. William James was introduced into the French Institut, and Henri Bergson, who was the best-known philosopher in France at that time, came to the United States to speak in American universities. During his time in the Senate, Clark would go to France not only for his collection, he would go to France once, sometimes twice a year. And he also went to see his ward. And Anna was becoming a poised, cultivated woman speaking perfect French. And this was a strong element in Clark's private love affair with France. And what had to happen, happened. They married in 1901. Clark was 62, and Anna was 39 years younger. They had two daughters, André and Huguette. Both of them were born in Paris. No, one was born in Paris, the other outside of Paris, perhaps in Algeria. But they stayed in Paris long enough to be brought up in the French language, and they stayed in Paris as long as the work on the mansion in New York was progressing. Now, what was the mansion? Now I have to talk about the mansion. The house on Fifth Avenue and 77th Street. It was called Clark's Folly. It's an enormous pile. It's incredible. All with, I'm sure you've seen photographs of it. He said that he wanted something the style of Louis XIII, adapted so as to be close to modern French style. There were 130 rooms. In the winter, it burnt 17 tons of coal a day. There was a train track that went underneath, directly into the basement of the house. And of course, all this for one couple and two children. Anyway, there were very many events, dinner with his banking friends, meetings of the French Institute, but more important than everything, in this enormous house, there were 4 very long galleries where all his collection of paintings hung. And he would spend long times moving up and down in front of them and looking at them with adoration. He really liked what he was seeing. His collection had grown. The French influence was even greater. He bought more contemporary works from Prudhon, from Delacroix, a wonderful painting called The Tiger and the Serpent. He bought Monticelli's, quite a few works by the Barbizon school, Rousseau, Daubigny, Troyon, Millet, and his favorites, Cazin and Corots. He bought 22 of each. He bought very few Impressionists. He had 1 Boudin and 4 Degas. He had no Monet. He had no Manet. Although they were priced very low, you could get a Monet in those days for 200 francs. But he preferred to depend on his dealers. He had a series of very well-known dealers, Knoedler, Seligman, Durand-Ruel, Bousset, Valadon, Georges Petit, and he talked to them, and these people didn't know much about the Impressionists. They didn't see the value of it. You know, this was something that they'd never seen before, and so they were very wary about it all, and they didn't really want to push the senator to doing this. So he took their advice, and he bought other things, as I explained to you. He bought, as I said, 22 Corots. Well, in the New York Times of the 24th of April 1910, I found an article saying that during the last 12 months, 2,487 fake Corots had arrived in the United States. In 1974 and 1979, American experts came to the Corcoran Art Gallery and went through the collection. And about half the Corots were considered doubtful. Anyway, he liked them, he had bought them, and that was it for him. I think he probably knew that maybe one of the other were not really what they should be, but he had them. My favorites of all this collection are two things. One is the life of Joan of Arc by Boutet de Monvel. These are 6 paintings that are about this size, and they depict the life of Joan of Arc from the meeting with the archangel and her, and on the English burning on the stake put up by the British in the English, I should say, in Rouen. That is one which every time I go to Washington, I go and see them. My mother had showed them to me when I was 14 years old, and they're really something which I love greatly. Now, and the other thing is the Salon Doré. The Salon Doré was, he had bought in Paris panels from a living room in the townhouse of the Comte d'Orsay, not far from the Seine. I don't think that he knew where these panels came from, but he bought them, and there were 4 panels because they had to be in this room in the house of the Comte d'Orsay. The room was square, but in the house on Fifth Avenue, the room where they had to be was rectangular. So what he did, he had 2 more panels made with themes that were more actual. One was about hunting and the other was about sport. So now you have, if you go to the Corcoran Art Gallery and you look at this wonderfully brilliantly white, because it's just been redone, you look at 6 panels instead of 4. Until 1914, the Clarks used to go to France once or twice a year. They often went in the summer. They had an apartment on Paris on the Avenue Victor Hugo. They rented houses in the summer in Fontainebleau or on the Seine Valley. Several times they went into a beautiful little castle, a 19th century castle called Le Petit Bourg, which unfortunately was destroyed at the beginning of the First World War when the Germans approached Paris very close during the First Battle of the Marne. And William Andrews Clark went on business trips to London, to Vienna, and then in August 1914, the war was declared. And like many other tourists, American tourists, they had to wait it out. The family waited until, I have to be going a bit fast there. August 1904, the war started. But then, as I said, the German offense came very close to Paris. And the people in Paris were worried that, in fact, the Germans would enter Paris because they were going so fast and coming so quickly. And we know, I'll tell you how, we know that the family left Paris and went off possibly to Brittany or in the south of France and waited. And then, as you know, the tide went off. The French were able to stop it, and the Germans moved back towards the German border. And the Clarks came back, and they were able to take one of the ships that the American government had sent to France to pick up the American tourists who were stranded, so to speak. And we know this through one very interesting thing. Here in Missoula, in those days, there was a lawyer who was called Walter Bickford, and he was the senator's lawyer when it had to do with the Montana Power Company. And in the Historical Society in Helena, I found 3 boxes of correspondence between the two. And they were all technical correspondence, what to do and everything, typed. But in the letters that the senator sent to his lawyer, he would write in the margin and explain with his handwriting and saying what he was doing, saying well, his wife was doing this, I'd go into this or that, and giving sort of personal news about, and that is how I figured out that he had remained in France until the last minute and was able to leave in September. Now, in 1915, Clark wanted to show that he was mentally and morally on the side of the French. He participated in a commission which erected a statue of Joan of Arc in New York. It was by Anne Hyatt, and you can see it now. It's Joan of Arc on a horse, and it's on the west side of Manhattan, above Riverside Drive, and at the end of 93rd Street. And for that, Clark loaned one of his bouteilles de Monvel for a fundraising exhibition. We know now that the United States entered the war, and in April 1917, which was just a few days after Woodrow Wilson convinced the Congress to declare war on the Germans, there was a mission that came from France to talk to the American government to explain what they needed, what France needed, and to help say to the American government, send soldiers as soon as you can. And they went first to New York, and among this mission came Marshal Joffre, the hero of the Marne. And this was a tremendous thing. The mayor of Paris, the mayor of New York, declared this would be the day of Paris, and everywhere, and especially around Union Square, there were flowers heaped around the statue of Lafayette. Every window had a French flag. It was an extraordinary time for Franco-American relations. And then they went to Washington, and the Marshal Joffre was asked to talk to Congress. And so he came up, look, I said, I do not speak English. Vive les États-Unis! And of course he was applauded like that. They said the whole people were there, exploded in shouts and screams and applause. In New York, Clark had further examples of his involvement with France. He was on the board of directors of the French Institute. He held house exhibitions of French art in his house. In April 1921, he was invited to a banquet of the French-American Society, a banquet given for René Viviani, the former French Prime Minister and the special envoy to the new president, Harding. He was getting on, the senator. His last visit to France was in summer of 1922. He went with his wife and with Huguette, first to Venice and then to Paris. This was the last time that he went to Europe. He laid a wreath on the tomb of the French unknown soldier underneath the Arc de Triomphe, as a scroll with the words, "A tribute to valor." There's a nice photograph of him doing that. Well, then he came back to New York, and he practically never went there and went anywhere else. These are what I call the sad days in which now I have to delve. First of all, in 1919, his eldest daughter, Andrée, age 17, died of meningitis. And Huguette was alone with her parents. And it's at that time that my mother and her sister, my aunt, went to Miss Spencer's school on the Fifth Avenue, and so did Huguette. So Huguette and my mother got to be sort of good friends at that time. In 1925, the senator died at his home, from pneumonia. He was 86 years old. He lied in state in front of the Corots. Coolidge sent flowers, and he was taken to his mausoleum. Clark had promised his two daughters, Mary and Catherine, that Anna, we call her Tante Anna in the family, that Tante Anna would not inherit the big house. And his will said that she could stay there until 1928, 3 years after his death. But she thought she was going to leave it immediately. All the art had gone to Corcoran Art Gallery, and she was all alone in this enormous house with her daughter, and she didn't think she wanted to stay there. So they took up into an apartment on 72nd Street and Fifth Avenue. The house was put out to sale, but it took to be sold. And it took a while because nobody saw how could they use this. And if they wanted to have the ground, they first had to demolish this enormous white elephant. But finally, they found somebody who was ready to do it, and it was torn down in 1927, and they got out of it this $3 million for something which had cost $7 million at the start. The collection went down to that part of his private collection that he had sent to the Corcoran Art Gallery, went down to Washington, and the four women of the senator's life, his wife, his three daughters, put in enough money to build a new wing of the Corcoran where his whole collection could be presented as such. Now we come to the end of the empire. Clark had counted on his two sons to manage the United Verde for the benefit of the whole family. But, and this is very American, is the story now. In 3 years, there were 3 deaths. In 1932, William Andrew Clark Jr.'s son, who was called Tertius because he was the third, died at the age of 30. He was in Clarkdale, and he was thought that Clarkdale should be a place where people would arrive, tourists and whatnot, with an airplane. So he had a little airport created, and he took airplane, studied the art of the airplane, and his instructor was well known. He was the instructor of Lindbergh. And on a Sunday, very sunny, they got into their plane and they were going to try to how to fly with instruments. And so there was a black cover that was put on their seats, and off they went. The idea was to be able to use a go and come and use the airplane, but with no vision outside. At one point, we don't know why, the plane started going down and down and down. It didn't go up. And both of these people were killed immediately. Then, in 1933, the next year, Charlie Clark, my grandfather, died of pneumonia in New York at the age of 62, and he was brought into the mausoleum next to his brother, his father. In 1934, William Andrews Clark Jr. had a heart attack at the age of 57 in his house in Montana, and he is interred in Los Angeles. And there was, of course, Charlie had a son called Paul, but he was a minor, so he had nothing to say. And the two sisters, Mary and Catherine, were then the sole owners of the United Verde. and they decided to sell. They say, we don't know anything about this. How can we do anything? So everything was sold. This enormous, because we were talking copper, but there was all sorts of other things in the empire, just disappeared. It became, cash and distributed among the family. And that was the end of his Clark, the empire. The sole male descent, I was talking about Paul Clark, who was the son of Charlie, died in 1962. But his son, Christopher, has two sons. So there are three living Clarks, male Clarks, and they all live in Carmel, California. I don't seem to have anything to do with the rest of the family. Well, what remains? What remains of all this? Well, there are houses in Butte. I saw them yesterday. There are 3, 4 of them. There's the mausoleum in Woodlawn. There are the houses and clubhouse that he built in Clarksdale near Jerome. William Andrews Jr. built a beautiful Italianate house, a museum in Los Angeles with a wonderful garden. There's the collection, of course, in Washington. And there's Huguette. Huguette is still alive. She'll be 100 next June. I get her on the phone every so often. And then she talks in French, of course. He talks about Papa. And Papa is a senator, and this is something fantastic. I can reach out and talk with somebody who knew directly her fight with her father. And all this is, for me, a powerful statement that William Andrews was able to have the life that he wanted, the life that he planned right from the beginning. He lived exactly as he had planned. And in his life, there was the love of France, the love of its culture and history. And that's really why I'm here today. Thank you.
We've got some time for questions, and I believe there are microphones, aren't there, in the aisleways? So if you have a question, please just approach the microphone. It's kind of tough for us to see up here because the lights are bright. But if you just approach the microphone, Ambassador Baeyens will be pleased to respond to questions if you have them. Can you see?
I don't know if anybody's in or you can raise your hand.
Right there, yeah. There we go.
Okay.
That's better.
Now, you can raise your hand. I mean, I think that we can communicate that way if you don't want to get up. Yes?
Do you happen to know what this economic event is in Santa Barbara?
Could you send it again? I'm sorry.
Do you know what
No. Give me your question again. I didn't hear. Yes, right there. There you go.
I was wondering what has happened to Bellas Guardo in Santa Barbara, if that is still owned by Huguette or
Yes, I didn't talk about that, but in Santa Barbara there's a rather handsome house and a very nice ground. I haven't seen it, but friends of mine and my sister have been there, what is called something Guardo.
Bellas Guardo.
Guardo, yes. And it belongs to Huguette. It belongs to Huguette. And she never goes there. She hasn't been there for years and years. But there is a staff to keep up the house. She also has another house in Connecticut where she's never been. And also there's a staff there. It's sort of strange, it's like a novel, that she never goes to these places, but nevertheless she insists that they be maintained and kept.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, do you think that was a great-grandfather, William Clark, was he aware of the legacy that he might be leaving to the future generations of Montana in terms of the pollution and water problems that we're still faced with today as a result of the operations of the copper barons in Butte?
Well, probably not, because there is a quotation of his when he was in the Senate saying that all that will be taken care of by technology and we don't have to worry about the future. So that can only give you this rather extraordinary, for us living now, reaction. You know, this is something I want to say. I know that here in Montana, the senator was this morning. What did she say? The senator was a scoundrel. All right. But you must not, you cannot, and you must not judge the way people acted a century ago with the standards of today. You must remember that the senator was pursuing what he wanted to do. He was giving jobs to tens of thousands of people, and he was doing what he wanted, which is to become a rich man. And he and many others did the same thing. So you cannot sort of point the finger and say, oh, you know, you didn't. No, I'm sorry, that is political nonsense.
Yes, I agree. He had plenty of company. Thank you very much.
I just find it unusual that he lived at the same time as the Carnegies and all these men that were, you know, the same. They went into these great industries that made them tons of money. They all lived at the same time.
Well, because at that time, they could do things much more the way they saw it, because there was no real presence of the federal government in the far west, you see. And so they were able to do these things. Then this was just a narrow moment in the history of the United States.
Yes, you intimated that the senator's fortune was disseminated, possibly squandered. But it sounded like Huguette is kind of well off.
Sorry?
It sounded like Huguette is fairly well off, so she must still have a considerable amount of the family fortune.
I suppose so, yes. Yeah. And I've never seen her, you know. She's been a recluse. I've never talked. I talk on the telephone sometimes, but it's a little bit stilted because we just say nice things to each other. But in French.
Has she ever come back to Montana?
Sorry?
Has she ever come back to Montana?
I don't think so. In fact, I don't think she ever's been to Montana.
Well, there's pictures of her in Corots, so she has.
Well then, okay, then I didn't know. I had the feeling that she had never come to Montana, because she lived really in New York.
When Senator LaFollette said that Clark was one of the 100 men who defined America, Clark had a strange ego trip, I understand, and the people who were designing the Capitol renovation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had plans to do the doors of the 100 most famous Pennsylvanians. And because Clark was not included, he very cleverly, I understand, I don't know if this is true, had his foundry include his likeness on the doors.
Oh, really? I didn't. I just, yeah, it's quite.
I understand that he had 4 secretaries who were very good publicity agents. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Any more questions? Any questions? Any questions?
Yes, we can.
If your curiosity is sated.
I'm sure by some of the questions we've had about Mr. Ambassador, that you, and through your other experiences here in Montana, you're well aware that Montana, the history of Montana that we view it today, many of us, is quite different than the history I was taught when I was in primary school in the history of Montana, which is, of course, the glorious development of the copper economy that you described. Now we deal a lot with the aftermath of that, which was also described. But I'm interested in your view of one thing, the conflict between your great-grandfather and Mark Staley, and just how your family views that particular episode, which is quite, either famous or notorious in Montana history.
Which particular, just the general feud between the two?
Yeah.
There are a number of episodes.
Oh, yes.
One would be the selection of Montana's capital.
Yes.
Which was one of the episodes. And the other was the battle for your grandfather and great-grandfather to become a senator.
Yes.
Those are the two episodes.
Yeah. Well, it was something. It is, if I can go back to his political life for a moment. It's extraordinary that the first time he tried to do something like that, to be elected, he wanted to be elected representative of the territory of Montana in the Congress in Washington. And this representative had to be elected. And so he went, he was a candidate, and he went on, he did the rounds and had a campaign, as did the others. The other was a Republican and who was backed by Marcus Daly. And this was the first time that he did it, and he made a terrible mistake. He knew that about 40% of the workers here were Irish. And he said, I come from Ireland too, but of course, he came from the county Tyrone, and he was a Presbyterian, not a Catholic. And he made the big mistake of putting forward as something necessary and good, which was free trade, which the American government does all the time. Free trade is. And at that point, my Irish workers were sure that my great-grandfather was an Anglophile, because for them, free trade was how Great Britain, or England, was holding power over the rest of the world. And so he lost this voting by 4,000 or 5,000 votes, which was his very first try. His try, or his success, which is wonderful, is that he was able to see to it that Helena would be the capital of the state, and not Anaconda, as Daly wanted. So there he did it very well. He was able to get what he wanted, and then there was this enormous party in Helena where he spent $30,000 for drinks for the happy crowd.
What are your thoughts on Daly now? I think that's what he wanted to know.
Oh, I have no thoughts on Daly now, I'm sorry. We were talking, I don't really know if he left a family. I know that he died in New York, but apart from that, I don't know anything about him.
great-grandfather, grandmother, my grandfather also. But you have to realize, in view, my family were not miners, my family were Republicans, and my family was Methodist.
Thank you, thank you.
Hear, hear.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why did you write the biography of your great-grandfather? What is the main motivating force of him?
Could you give me that again? I'm sorry.
Why are you writing a biography about your great-grandfather? What is the main motive?
What is the main motive? Well, because I'm writing it in French for the French reader. He's totally unknown in France. And it permits me not only to talk about my great-grandfather, but also about the relations between France and the United States. Because he, in a way, was going along at that time, and it was intertwined with these different events in the relations between France and the United States.
Is that one of the things that you think his influence remains today? Is that interplay?
Can you give me it again? Can you say again?
Is it your belief that that's one of his legacies? The continuing relationship between France and the U.S. Somehow?
No, I think he accompanied this. I mean, he went along, and he was an example of many people in the United States, especially in the people who had culture and knew things abroad, their sentiment towards France. And it's still, in France, in the United States, the people who are the most Francophile are either people of society or people in the academic or in the schools, because they are interested in other countries. And I've met many young married couples who come up to me and extol France. They went there and they had the bicycle tour for 2 weeks, and they loved every moment of it. See, this is the basis of what we hope to develop in the United States to counter the nonsense that you see in the newspapers or that you hear other places.
Ambassador, thank you for coming. I'm wondering if you could talk about his involvement in France, business-wise and politically.
Well, this is we're not quite sure. He didn't have, I think, any people, and he didn't sell copper in France. He sold it in Germany and in Austria, but not in France. I think for him, France was a place where he would do things that cultural, his great his connections and all that he had collected. And we know that he never tried to meet with French political people. He didn't even go and see the American ambassador. He didn't want to play this game in France. For him, France was something different, where he could expand his view in art.
But he did promote that view when he was in New York, though, as I understand from your argument.
Yes.
He was very active politically in New York.
Not politically. Not politically. I said he was a member of the French Institute and things like that. And he played the role of somebody who loved France and who wanted to show it. Yes.
He was a very wealthy man, with a lot of influence.
Well, he had hoped to be, some people say he had hoped to be elected or appointed French ambassador to France, but of course he couldn't because he was a Democrat, and all the, at that time, most of the presidents that he knew were all Republicans.
Well, thank you all very much. This has been a unique and I think a rather remarkable opportunity to see into our state's past in someone who's been a rather mysterious character, I think, in Montana's past too. And so it's wonderful that we've had the opportunity to hear from the ambassador tonight. He'll be here on the platform for a few minutes if some of you want to come up and visit with him personally, but thank you all very much again.
Thank you.